Welcome to Surrender School. This is the 2023 Quick Step Study.
Let's start with a set-aside prayer. So once again, we will be talking about pages 42 through 53 possibly, and we'll be looking at sessions G and H of the video sessions. We'll also be working into action today. So before we get started, though, I want to step back because we're on step 5, 6, and 7, which means we've covered 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in step 1, we found complete despair, powerlessness. I'm powerless over food. My life is unmanageable. And I can't stop the compulsive overeating and addictive eating for me on my own. So then we get into step 2, which we find hope, and by finding a power within ourselves, or being willing to turn to a power greater than ourselves to restore us to sanity. So step 1 is the problem. Step 2 is the solution. And then in step 3, we make a decision. Step 3 is only a decision. That's when we are willing to try to find a higher power. And then we got into step 4. Now, step 4 is broken down into 3 sections there. It was resentments. Resentments are nothing more than the past didn't go my way. The second aspect of step 4 was fear. The future won't go my way. And the third aspect of it was our sex conduct, or our conduct, which is about relationships and figuring out how to handle difficult one-on-one relationships. So the Big Book's ordering of step 4 is basically dealing with the past, which is resentment, dealing with the future, which is our fear, and learning how to live in the present with other people, which is about conduct, and not just our sex conduct. So in steps 5, 6, and 7, it says that we can do that in just one day. So can I get someone to please read the slide here?
I'll read. Robin, compulsive overeating and sugar addict. Steps 5, 6, and 7 in one day. You may ask how we can discuss 3 steps in one chapter. The reason is that the Big Book actually has us do steps 5, 6, 7, and even 8 on the same day. The Big Book's approach is very simple. In steps 4 and 5, we identify the character defects that block us from our higher power. In steps 6 and 7, we acknowledge our readiness to have those defects removed. And the defects are removed through the actions taken in steps 8 and 9. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Robin, for reading that. So now we move into step 5. Step 5 is admit it to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Well, why do we need to do that? So let's find out why. On page 72 of AA's Big Book, in the Into Actions chapter, they start to talk about the step 5. Would someone be willing to read page 72 of AA's Big Book, Into Action? Joe, please go ahead.
Having made our personal inventory, what shall we do about it? We have been trying to get a new attitude, a new relationship with our Creator, and to discover the obstacles in our path. We have admitted certain defects. We have ascertained in a rough way what the trouble is. We have put our finger on the weak items in our personal inventory. Now these are about to be cast out. This requires action on our part, which, when completed, will mean that we have admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our defects. This brings us to the 5th step in the program of recovery mentioned in the preceding chapter.
Thank you, Joe. And then on page 42 of our step study guide, the Big Book discusses step 5 from pages 71 to 75. This is why we're taking the 5th step. Why would I admit to God, to myself, and another human being the exact nature of my wrongs? Would someone please read starting from the answer is ultimately pretty simple?
The answer is ultimately pretty simple. If we skip this vital step, we may not overcome drinking compulsive eating, page 72. The big book explains this in some detail, excuse me. It is important, it says, in completing our house cleaning. If, as we found in step 3 and 4, our problem is one of ego, of self-will, then we have to learn humility, that we aren't and can't be in charge of our own lives, let alone the world. People, they say, who don't do step 5 had not learned enough humility, fearlessness, and honesty in the sense we find it necessary until they told someone else all their life story. Page 73. We live, they say, in a double life in which we pretend to be someone we're not. We must be entirely honest with somebody if we expect to live long or happily in this world. Page 73, 74. 74 deals with choosing the person we share our story with. Aside from a very basic notion of confession is good for the soul, there are other good reasons as well, not listed in the big book. We find that we aren't alone, that the person with whom we are sharing understands us and can probably match every one of our actions with one of his or her own. And we also get insight and feedback that might help understand ourselves. Neither taking ourselves too lightly or too seriously. Sorry.
Thank you, Sue. Appreciate your reading. So basically, in a nutshell, why we do this, because if we skip this step, we might not recover, is really what it comes down to. So moving forward, who do we share this? Who do we share this step with? Who do we trust enough to be able to share step 5 with? And the big book had some suggestions on that. Would someone please read the yellow part?
Yeah, I'll read. Hi, it's Davari.
Hi.
Who? We must remember that the big book was published when there were no more than 100 AAers in the world. So the big book tells us how to find someone. The criteria are simple. It is important that he be able to keep a confidence, that he fully understand and approve of what we are driving at, that he will not try to change our plan. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your reading there. And this is taken from session G from the website here.
So then he goes into the who. Okay, who do we do step 5 with? And he says on the top of page 43 on the left-hand column, the criteria are simple. It is important that he be able to keep a confidence, that he fully understand and approve what we are driving at, that he will not try to change our plan. A little bit further down at the bottom of the next paragraph, not only have I learned humility, but I have found out that I am not alone. OAers or other 12-steppers can give us that extra ingredient, which is so helpful for us isolated and self-pitying selves. Again, the common humanity. We are all bozos on the same bus. Nobody's better or worse than anybody else. And the confidence part, I think, is very important. And, you know, I've always typically used my sponsor as the person that I give my step 5 to, because they typically know me the best and they've heard me whining and complaining all along, and they can kind of see the patterns and so they have a little bit more of an insight, and they also know what I'm doing, what I'm trying to accomplish in this. I think there's a tendency if we share this with someone else, other people wanna, oh, it's not that bad. Oh, you know, it's that person deserved that, you know, and that's not what we need when we're giving a 5th step. We need to see it very clearly, and we need to see our own character defects in our behavior. We don't want to be given any excuses to continue on with those character defects. So that's why I think it's really important we find someone that knows what we're trying to do here. And I don't know about you guys, but when I did my first 5th step, I felt so much shame around what I was sharing. Now it's like, oh, this is what I did and this is what I did. But the first time that I did it, it was just dripping in shame. And I think if I had given it to someone else who didn't really know what I was trying to do through the 12 steps, they would have been busy comforting me instead of helping me really see my behavior. And so I think that's why sponsors are a natural to go ahead and take a 5th step. But it's not always. Sometimes you may not feel safe enough with your sponsor to do that. And if you can find another person safer, like a therapist or something, then that may be the way to go.
Oh, I can identify with that. The first time I ever took my 5th step, I shared it with a person, and then I heard it again in the front of the rooms. So I didn't feel safe to do that again with another sponsor. And the next time I did it with a therapist, and she dropped me shortly thereafter. So, what's the balance for me? So, yeah, finding that right person is vital for your recovery. Moving on to page 43 of the Step Study Guide, how we should be doing this. Would someone please read the how of this from page 43 of the Big Book Study Guide?
I will. The big book then gives us instructions for meeting with the person to whom we tell our story. We explain to our partner what we're about to do and why we have to do it. He should realize that we are engaged upon a life and death errand. Most people approached in this way will be glad to help. They will be honored by our confidence. When I do step 5, I tell my friend how important it is that I do this step, how serious I am about the process. The big book's instructions on actually doing the step are not very detailed. Here they are. We pocket our pride and go to it, eliminating every twisted character, every dark cranny of the past. Page 75. That's it. Exactly what are we supposed to do?
Thank you so much for reading for us there. And then, so that is the how. This is how we do it. We explain to somebody that we're doing this because we're trying to save our lives, and most people will be understanding. So yeah, it's really great. Moving on to still on page 43, we go back and we look at our resentment form. And if you have this PDF file that is on the website, the blue link at the bottom that says resentment forms will actually take you to this form if you want to click on it and go back and write your own information in it. These were just the examples that I used last week when we were doing step 4. So in doing this next step, step 4 here, would someone please read the yellow part of this form?
Christine, I can read.
Thank you, Christine.
I take the step 4 resentment form is folded over with the name of the person, institution, or principal, column 1, across from where I have been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened, column 4. I read off the name, perhaps give a short identifier or explanation of the name, and then read off what I have written in the 4th column. I invite my friend to probe my responses to see if there are other things I might write down and didn't think of. I go from name to name.
Thank you, Christine. So that's just column 1 where I talked about my coworker. He is they are an example of people. The international government was my example of institution, and I will never recover was an example of principles. So then I went over to the next column, which we're going to see next. As a reminder, there's a link in the upper right corner, the video link. I will try to put that up there when there's a part of the video that, maybe don't need to be played in this particular environment right now, but you can go back and review what Linda had to say in those links, in that link rather. Moving on to the next column there, page 43. We're talking about taking the fear form. Would someone please read the yellow box there?
Robin, then I take the step 4 fear form and read it across the columns. Here is one fear, column 1. Here are the reasons I have it, column 2. I place my trust and reliance upon my finite self, column 3, and it didn't work, column 4. And I said the fear prayer, column 5. I then discuss briefly exactly what I think my higher power would have me be in relation to that fear.
Great, thank you so much. And going back to the form that I created last week, remember, it was coworker, it was international government, and I will never get recover. And as far as my coworker, what it turned out to be, the actual dysfunction there for me was perfectionism. And then for international government, it was negative thinking. It was also selfish thinking, is what we talked about last week, for me at least. And then the last one, I am unlovable. Somehow being overweight or being underweight or my body image for me translated into whether or not I'm able to be loved. And what that really came down to is the character defect is self-pity. And then I went, why did I have this fear? And I definitely was relying on myself, and it did not work. I said the prayer and I stated what I would think God would have me to be, not what he would have me to do, what my higher power would have me to be. Then we move on to the sex conduct form for the next part of step 5 rather. Can someone please read the yellow portion of this slide?
I'll read it. It's Devari. Then I take the step 4 sex conduct form and read it across the columns. Here is the person I hurt, column 1. Here are the ways in which I was selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate, column 2. I aroused suspicion, but not bitterness or jealousy, column 3. What I should have done instead was blank, column 4. The relationship was selfish, column 5. And I said the sex prayer, column 6, and the sex meditation, column 7.
Thank you, Divine. All right, so on my example that I put up here last week, I talked about my ex-boyfriend, and that relationship was not a healthy one for me. And I did a lot of things to try to save the relationship, but in the process, I was doing a lot of hurting, not only to myself, but to others as well. I did selfish things like I didn't want to be alone, so I stayed in a relationship, just because it was a good sexual relationship. I was purposely flirting with others. And what I was reminded about last week was the dishonesty was not only me purposely flirting with others to get attention, but what about the person I was flirting with? I knew I had no intentions of being, of trying to start anything with that person. I was just using that person. So I had forgotten about that part of the dishonesty. And where was I inconsiderate? Instead of accepting the ending, I cared more about getting my desires met. And then also I started trying to get even by, doing little things to make him think he was crazy. And I was just really just seeking validation. So yeah. And did I arouse jealousy and suspicion? You betcha, I sure did. And where was I at fault? I wanted him to change, but he wasn't ready to change, and I wasn't ready to accept that he wasn't ready to change. And what should I have done instead? I should have accepted a long time ago that he showed me who his true character was, and I stayed. I can't blame him for that. That's on me. I should have ended the relationship and honored my own integrity, and I didn't. And was this relationship selfish? Absolutely, it was on both of our parts. But I'm not clearing up his side of the street. I'm clearing up my side. So yes, it was selfish for me. And I did that prayer, and I did the sex meditation around that. And I also I actually did the last column as well. I made sure that I did do each one of those meditations and prayers. Now, there are more people on my list other than my ex-boyfriend when I did this in reality, but this is just one example. And then we have the promises, step 5 promises from pages 43 and 44 of the Big Book Study Guide. This is also on page 75 of our Big Book. Would someone be willing to read what those 5th step promises are?
The Big Book makes certain promises at the end of this part of step 5. If we do not fill these promises, then we have almost certainly left something out, either in step 4 or step 5. Here are the promises as found on page 75. Once we have taken this step, withholding nothing, we are delighted. We can look the world in the eye. We can be alone at perfect peace and ease. Our fears fall from us. We begin to feel the nearness of our Creator. You may have had certain spiritual beliefs, but now you begin to have a spiritual experience. The feeling that the drink problem has disappeared will often come strongly. We feel we are on the broad highway, walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe.
Thank you, Francine. And while we can hear you, you sound a little far away. So thank you so much for taking the time to read. So those are the promises. Once we've taken this step, withholding nothing, and that's the big part for me. And I did notice a typo. I am seeing that. Withholding nothing, we are delighted, it says. We can actually look the world in the eye. And, you know, for so many years, I would just look down and not look anybody in the eye when I'm talking. I'd look any place but in their eye because I had so much shame. And what this is telling me is that we might be able to be relieved of a little bit of that. Looks like somebody drew on the slide, but that's okay. I can fix that later. And then let's see what Linda had to say about this step.
Okay, then further down on page 44 on the left-hand side, after the bullet, he says, the first time I did this part of step 5, these promises did not come to me. My sponsor suggested I redo step 4 and then do another step 5. I did that, and the promises still didn't come to me. So I did another step 4 and another step 5, and then another. The amazing thing was that each time I redid step 4, I discovered new resentments and new fears and occasionally new sex conduct issues. So I could tell I was going deeper. After the fourth step 4 and the fourth step 5, these promises came true. It was an amazing experience. And maybe during the sharing, we can talk a little bit about this. I mean, the tenacity he had there is exceptional. I don't know if I would have had that level of tenacity, but I give him a lot of props because he clearly did. And he did it until the promises came true for him. And I give him a lot of credit for that. I can honestly say, I don't know if I would have been that tenacious. I would like to think I would be, but I doubt it.
I'm there with you, Linda. We're not quite finished. We're on page 44 of AA's Big Book Study Guide. We're still in step 5 at the moment. Could someone please read the yellow part of not yet finished? Once again, page 44A, Big Book Study Guide.
Christine, I can read. Not yet finished, but step 5 isn't yet finished. We've admitted to ourselves and another human being the exact nature of our wrongs, but we haven't yet admitted them to God. The Big Book tells us to go home and find a place where we can be quiet for an hour, carefully reviewing what we have done. We thank God from the bottom of our heart that we know him better, on page 75. So we review what we've written. We look at all our filled out forms again. Then we have a prayer. God, thank you from the bottom of my heart that I know you better. Then the Big Book tells us to study the first 5 steps and to ask our higher power if we have admitted anything, page 75. Have we done what has to be done? Have we said what has to be said? If the answer is yes, and it probably will be yes, then we go on to step 6 that same day. If the answer is no, then we go back and figure out what we left out in either step 4 or step 5.
Thank you, Christine. And you will remember we ask ourselves if we've omitted anything, and that'll be important in the next couple of slides here. Let's see what Linda has to say.
That's that kind of alone time with my higher power after the experience of step 5 was very powerful for me. It felt like the facade and the pretense of how I'd been living my life was falling away. it wasn't completely gone, but it was starting to fall away. It was starting to loosen. And that was an incredibly moving experience for me when I felt that.
Yeah, that's the first time I did this. I didn't take that time afterwards. I didn't follow the advice. Therefore, I didn't get any of the benefits because I really wasn't willing to let it go. Really wasn't. So when the next time I did it, I took this time, and it really was very, very powerful moment. I didn't yet get the recovery. So I'm like Lori in the sense that I had to do it several times before I was starting to see a little bit of the change for me. And once again, I said at the beginning of this, these are the questions that come at the back of at the step into step 5. I really wanted to know from you, do you have someone that you trust enough to do step 5 with holding nothing back? I mean, holding nothing back. Are you holding anything back? If so, why are you holding it back? You don't need to tell us what. And then I'll ask if anybody cares to share a part of their step 5. Okay, so now we're moving on to step 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character. Boy, I really thought I had to remove those defects of character, and God was just along for the ride. My higher power is just along for the ride. I thought I had to do all the work, but turns out I didn't. On page 76 of AA's big book, they start to talk about where step 6 begins. Would someone please read page 76 of AA's big book? First paragraph there.
I'll read it. If we can answer to our satisfaction, we then look at step 6. We have emphasized willingness as being indispensable. Are we now ready to let God remove from us all the things which we have admitted are objectionable? Can he now take them all, every one? If we still cling to something we will not let go, we ask God to help us be willing.
Yes, the willingness here. That's all we're really asking here. Moving on to step 6, doing step 6, steps 4 and 5 of the big book way, we realize that, excuse me, we have 4 major character defects, all stemming from our wish to have our own way. Step 1, we were selfish, we were dishonest, we were self-seeking, and we were full of fear. Out of these 4 major characteristics, we have constructed any number of behaviors that create problems for us, or a tendency to isolate, or to gossip, or to live in fantasy world, that is me, or to manipulate others, or to have bad relationships with others, that's me, or to be full of anger, to be paralyzed with fear, or to be full of lust and gluttony, or pride, or sloth, or greed, or envy, or to feel exceedingly sorry for ourselves. Ooh, that one hit hard for me. Or a combination of many of these things. But all of these behaviors come down to 4 character defects. These 4 character defects. We're going back. Were we selfish? We were selfish. We were dishonest. We were self-seeking, and we were full of fear. Those are the 4 character defects. Are we ready to have a higher power remove these 4 major character defects? My experience tells me that you will be, if you do steps 4 the big book way. You won't want to hold selfishness, dishonesty, self-seeking, or fear when you realize how they've truly harmed your life. And I know for me, that was the case with my mom. When I was going through this and I was working a serious amends around my mother, by the time I got to it, I could see my own character defects. Not the fact that some of the things that she did, yes, were cruel and they were unhinged and the whole 9, but it was me holding on to it and causing that same type of perpetuating that same type of behavior in relationships that came thereafter. So that no longer was my mom's fault. I learned it from her, but I'm over 18. I am no longer a victim. I am now a volunteer. So am I willing to change? So moving on to page 44 of AA's Big Book Study, would someone be willing to read the Big Book promises nothing at step 6?
I'll read. The Big Book promises nothing at step 6. Our higher power is not going to remove our character defects at step 6. The promise of that will only come halfway through step 9. So if you're ready to have your higher power remove these 4 major character defects, you're on to step 7. If you're not, you say, God, please help me be willing to remove my character defects of blank. Then go on to step 7 anyway. Why wait? Recovery is just around the corner.
Thank
Thank
you. So, step 7 it is. We move on to step 7. Step 7, humbly asked him, being your higher power, to remove our shortcomings. We've already identified those shortcomings, so now we're just asking for help to have them removed. So now would someone be willing to read from page 45 of the Big Book Study Guide, which also is page 76 of the Big Book, AA's Big Book. Joe?
Step 7, you say the prayer on page 76 of the Big Book. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Amen.
Thank you, Joe. Powerful prayer, actually, or at least it is for me. And let's see what Linda has.
Already, so we go right into step 7. Okay. He says on page 45, right-hand side, you say the prayer on page 76 of the Big Book. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Amen. He says a brilliant prayer. We get to keep some of the minor symptoms of those defects of character which do not stand in the way of our usefulness to our higher power and our fellows. So he's saying we're not in saint school. We're not in the process of being, driven as pure as the white snow. Okay, we are not going to be perfect people after we do this. I think that's great to remind us of that. He says, we may have those, I have many of them, interests that occasionally turn into obsessions, for instance. But it's simply a prayer. The Big Book is very clear about this. There are no promises for step 7 either. You just say the prayer and then you're ready for some action. I think that's really simple and straightforward. And I think people do get caught up with the notion that when they say the prayer, their character defects are supposed to be completely removed before they move on to the other steps. And that's not true. You're just saying the prayer for their removal and you move on and you take more action. There's no reason at all to get stuck there.
Thank you, Linda. So I agree with that. I've gotten stuck many times thinking, well, I prayed about it. Why didn't it disappear? It doesn't happen like that. I wish, I really do wish, but it doesn't happen, or at least it hasn't happened like that for me. It usually it happens over a gradual amount of time for me. And I come to start to see, oh, I'm not doing that anymore. That's interesting. Didn't even notice it. So yeah. And then there's some steps, some questions, and these questions can be found on page 46 of our study guide. And this is where I usually will engage all of you in the conversation. But at this point, we're still recording. And if you feel like if you want to be on tape and you want to share a little bit of your experience from slide 18 as well, feel free to do so at this time. I don't see any raised hands. Hearing nothing, we will move on then, okay? So then we move into the next steps, which is going to be steps 8 and 9. And they're from pages 47 and 53. These can now be found on the website, on the Surrender School website. If you go there, They're now posted. Joy posted them this morning. And Lori C did the workshop of session H here, and he read a lot from Into Action, pages 76 through 84. So step 8 and 9. Step 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make an amends to them all. And step 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So starting with step 8 and 9 here, we're on page 47 of our Big Book study guide. And if you don't have this and you're not on the link, it is on the Surrender School website once again. So in steps 8 and 9, they're not discussed separately in the Big Book. They're discussed as one action, making amends, which is broken down into 2 parts, being ready to make the amends to everyone we've hurt and only making amends if we won't hurt other people, including those we've already hurt. So we won't re-injure someone here. The Big Book instructions are simple. We first make a list of people we have harmed and figure out what harms we've done to them. We made that list, and the Big Book says, when we took the inventory, page 76, then we make those amends unless to do so would injure them or others. Really quite simple. And for years I read, well, I'm not making that amends because I know I'm going to get my feelings hurt. Well, that doesn't say anything about my feelings. It's saying if it's going to hurt them, if it's going to hurt someone else. And there's a couple of amazing stories in the Big Book about like a spouse that chose not to tell a wife that he'd been cheating on her because it was going to, cause more trouble than it was going to fix. And then on the flip side, there's another one that ends up telling his wife and, making the amends behind that. He had to make a living amends because he was cheating and he chose not to say anything because it would actually destroy more than just her. So yeah, there's a couple stories in the Big Book about that. So then we go on to page 76 of AA's Big Book. Would someone be willing to read page 76, AA's Big Book, please? Starting with now we need more action.
Now we need more action, without which we find that faith without works is dead. Let's look at steps 8 and 9. We have a list of all persons we have harmed and to whom we are willing to make amends. We made it when we took inventory. We subjected ourselves to a drastic self-appraisal. Now we go out to our fellows and repair the damage done in the past. We attempt to sweep away the debris which has accumulated out of our effort to live on self-will and run the show ourselves. If we haven't the will to do this, we ask until it comes. Remember, it was agreed at the beginning we would go to any lengths for victory over alcohol. Pass.
Thank you, Robin. And, I had agreed that I'd go to any lengths, but telling that person about that thing that I did or that food that I stole out of the drawer, I don't know if I'm really willing to do it. Thus, I held on to it. And we all know what happened. I ate again. I re-injured myself with the food again. I didn't re-injure anybody else. I was still stealing from food out of other people's desks, but I didn't get well. So, and once again, there is a link to what Lori starts to talk about this at the beginning of the video. And about 18 minutes in, he starts to talk about exactly what's happening in step 8 and 9. Then he goes on to talk about a little bit. So we're going to see what Lori has to say.
I want to be ready to make amends. I want to know the harm I've done. I want to be in a position to speak from my heart. I have found, my own experience, is that if you really know the harm you've done, then the words will come. That you might feel better writing it out, but if I were you, I wouldn't read it. I would maybe write it out so I know the kinds of things I want to say. But when the time comes, if you're ready, the words come and they're better probably than what you wrote down. If you're not ready to make that amends, you pray to be ready to make those amends. You focus more on, well, what harm did I do? And again, in the complicated issues of amends, where you've been the victim, you really have to figure out what harm you did. It's very important.
Oh, we're going to stop that there because there is a slide that's a little bit later on, figuring out the harm that I did. And when I heard this the first time, I got so turned off that I stopped doing this study. I mean, just like, I can't even do anymore. I'm done with this. I don't want to talk about this, because the first thing I thought about was my assailant. I was sexually hurt at a younger age, and I'm thinking, well, what was my part in it? We're going to see this a little bit later on. Not necessarily, I had no part in what that person did to me. Zero part in that. I wasn't wrong in that. It's the re-injury that I did, or it's the injuries that I caused other people that came into my life from unhealed trauma. And that's the part that I get to own. Not what they did to me, but me hurting other people because I was hurt, and scaring off other people and doing horrible things to people. So yeah, we'll see that probably, I think, about 3 more slides. So there are types of amends that we make. There's the first one that we're going to be talking about is direct amends. And there's 3 parts to the direct amends. So would someone be willing to start to read where it says direct amends and number 1?
I'll read.
Thank you.
Direct amends 1. The big book, through examples, lists 3 kinds of direct amends. The first is eyeball to eyeball. I am sorry for what I have done. The first amends, eyeball to eyeball, is described from the bottom of page 76 to the middle of page 78 with the example of confronting the person face to face and apologizing for our side of the action. That same amends is then described from the harm toother's perspective from the bottom of page 80 to the middle of page 82 with the example of whether or not to tell a spouse of an extramarital affair. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading for us. And Lori goes on to talk a little bit about that and gives us a little bit of an example.
And one of the most powerful amends I made was to a person who had been I've been very, very close to, who I had done one thing that I really regretted. He did a lot more things that he ought to have regretted. I went to him and I just followed the instructions. I said, I did this to you at this particular time at that particular place. I feel terrible about it. I want to balance the books. Is there anything I can do? His response, because he was still at odds with me, I don't remember it. And basically, I was ushered out the door of his office. But I'll never forget, this is very early on in my recovery, I'll never forget how I felt when I left that office. A huge weight had been lifted off me because I had done what I had to do. Whether his reaction was appropriate was his problem now, not mine. I felt sorry for him that he could not be in the close relationship that we used to have. And I felt as if I had done all I could, and anything he wanted to do, he could do or not, that was his problem. And I would see him occasionally at parties or something like that. And instead of running away from him, as I used to do before I made the amends, he would run away from me. He felt uncomfortable with me. I noticed that. I would treat him with happiness. I'd be happy to see him. I try to engage in conversation with him. He would, walk away. But because I had done my part, I no longer had this issue. 10, 15 years later, he came around.
Yeah. Eyeball to eyeball are scary amends, direct amends for me. And one of the things that kept me stuck in 1, 2, 3, it kept me stuck for a long time in all of my steps, or this is where I normally stop. If I had to go to that person and admit to being less than perfect, or treating them in a way that sometimes I didn't even know about. Because remember, I would gossip about people sometimes, and that would and then have to admit something to them, you know. So sometimes a living amends is better for me. It was easier for me to make a living amends, but where I could make direct amends, I did. There's still a few that I still have to make, but yeah, this was pretty powerful to me. And then there's a second amends, part of the direct amends. The second part is restitution. And there are two links also for this that Lori talks about. He talks about it at minute 27 and at minute 29. Would someone be willing to read direct amends 2 from this part of the slide? From page 47.
I can read. The big book through examples lists 3 kinds of direct amends. The second is restitution. I will make up for what I have done. The second amends, restitution, is described on page 78 with the example of debts, and then described from the harm to others perspective on page 79 with the example of paying alimony to an ex-wife with the result of harming the current family. The third amends, public consequences, is described from the bottom of page 78 to the top of page 79 with the example of willingness to go to jail, and then described from the harm to others perspective on page 80 with the example of making up for a lost reputation. When you think about it, these are the only 3 kinds of direct amends. You go directly to a person and apologize and or make up for the harm you've done, or if the harm you've done has had broader consequences, you have to make broader amends.
Thank you, Kristen. So the third type of amend, this is direct amends. There's the third part of it, and that is taking public consequences. Would someone please read the public consequences slide?
I will. The big book through examples lists 3 kinds of direct amends. The third is taking the public consequences. I will make known to other people what I have done. The third amends, public consequences, is described from the bottom of page 78 to the top of page 79 with the example of willingness to go to jail, and then described from the harm to others perspective on page 80 with the example of making up for a lost reputation. Pass.
Thank you, Robin. Valerie, if you would read the next slide, that would be wonderful. The next amends is living amends.
Living amends. The big book discusses living amends from the middle of page 82 to the middle of page 83. Here, the concept is that direct amends simply aren't enough for people with whom we've had long-term relationships. They don't need apologize or restitution. They need a new person to have a relationship with.
Ah, thank you, Valerie. And this is true for my amends that I made with my sister. You know, lifelong in a relationship, lifelong with my sister. And I tried to make that apology, and my sponsor said, no, you don't need to do that. What you need to do is show up different. And that is what I've been doing. And I've gotten a very different response from my sister. You know, I will be going home in a couple of weeks here after the holidays, and I'm going to see, we're going to put this through a test. We are going to see if it works. But I have been showing up differently. And also, when I read this, that they need a new person to have a relationship with. When I was in a long-term relationship with that ex-boyfriend that I talked about, he needed a new person. It was not me. And sometimes it is accepting that the person that needs to show up is not me, and having the freedom to say, I will do no more harm to this person by staying away from them. And that, in my case, was what I had to do. And then there are the amends that we can't make. Would someone please read page 47, the amends that we cannot make?
Sure, I will.
Thank you, Joy.
Okay, and on page 83, the big book discusses amends that we can't make and promises us that if we are ready to make them, that is good enough. The big book provides 2 basic rules for making amends. The first is that if they are possible to make, we must make them or else we will not recover. The second is that in making our amends, we sweep our side of the street off and don't deal with the wrongs others have done to us. I'll deal with variants of that issue a little later on.
Thank you, Joy. And this is funny, is when I was writing mine out, I had somebody I had to make an amends to, and I just wrote them on there thinking, I'm never going to see this person again. Never, ever, never, ever, never going to see them again. And not 4 weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, I don't remember how many weeks later, but it wasn't very long. I went to a Thanksgiving dinner, and this wasn't this year. This was a few years back. Went to a Thanksgiving dinner at somebody's house I'd never been to. And guess who their neighbor was? That person that was on my amends list. And I was thinking, I'm never going to have to do this. So the whole Thanksgiving, I was so anxious. And so finally, I pulled the person aside. I went over and I pulled them aside. That we were outside. They didn't even remember what I was talking about. Here I am, just stressing about it. Didn't even remember. So it's amazing. I wasn't willing to make the amends, but just like Lori said, when I walked away from that conversation, I felt 10 feet tall, like something had just lifted from me. Amends that we can't make. We're going to continue with that from page 49. Would someone please read the amends that we can't make?
Amends we can't make. The Big Book provides 2 basic rules for making amends. The first is that they are possible if they are possible to make. We must make them or else we will not recover. The second is that in making our amends, we sweep our side of the street off and don't deal with the wrongs others have done to us. What about amends we can't make? People who are dead, for instance. There are many suggestions, of course, ranging from just being serene because we know we're ready to make amends, to having imaginary conversations with them, to doing symbolic things like writing letters and scattering the pieces to the winds, or going to the gravestones. What works for one person may not work for another.
Thank you so much for reading that. So closing out with a serenity prayer.
See you next week.